for the prayer session that he's about to go into. So this is, again, there are times when theory and practice don't meet. In this case, I think there's little reason to conclude that he didn't mean what he wrote. Sorry about this, folks. It's going. Is there any way for you to do this from the back, maybe? Or I don't know why it's behaving this way.
Isn't it looking if you point it at the...
If you point it here.
Sorry?
Point it at the...
At this device.
That thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I did want to show you this, and we may have to skip some material and just pick it up in the questions, maybe. Allama Tabatabai, who died in 1981, is literally the most important Shiite intellectual, luminary, theologian, philosopher of the 20th century. His Quranic commentary is the most important modern Quranic commentary for Shiites. And I did go through it with the help of a translator. Parts of it had been translated by the Iranian government, other parts had not. But this particular part I thought was critical. This is a central Quranic verse, which is very anti-Semitic. And here's his gloss on it. The Jews, although they had the same alternatives as the Christians, and they could retain their religion with payment of the jizya, the Quranic poll tax, yet they continued in their haughtiness, became harder in their bigotry, and turned to double dealing and deception. They broke their covenants, eagerly waited calamities to befall the Muslims, and dealt to them the bitterest deal. The enmity of the Jews toward the divine religion, Islam, and their sustained arrogance and bigotry have continued exactly in the same manner even after the Prophet. These unchanged characteristics confirm what the mighty book, the Quran, had indicated. And again, so I mentioned earlier that perhaps the sort of relatively benign Shiite eschatology vis-a-vis the Jews, again, being much worse in terms of Shiite eschatology, the Jews are replaced essentially by the Sunnis. Maybe that's changing. There's some evidence for that. But the bottom line is we see just an unbroken chain of calls for annihilation from Khomeini through Rouhani, and also including Musavi. Musavi, again, who was the political leader of the Green Movement, at least according to U.S. experts, made exactly the same call. I think his was a cancer metaphor, so the cancer that had to be excised. So this is not going away. There was okay. I think there was a reasonable hypothesis that, for heaven's sake, after they went through the Pahlavi period, the Iranians, it was autocratic, it was brutal in its own way, but it did introduce some westernization, some secularization. It certainly improved the plight of women. It certainly improved the plight of non-Muslim minorities. Would there be some resentment over the restoration of the Sharia in its full force after 35 years? And I think there is some resentment. The question is, can we quantify it? And I give credit to Pew for going into Iran and doing just that. And unfortunately, the hypothesis that it's been massively rejected, the Sharia has been massively rejected, despite everything that we see going on. I mean, the stoning, the execution of homosexuals, the complete abrogation of freedom of conscience, the persecution of religious minorities. Yes, I mean, if you look at a glass half full, or at least, I don't know, 1/5 full, 17% don't want that. But 83% do. I mean, we can't just wish those kinds of numbers away, and I think that's very important. And as an epidemiologist, I looked, you try and, people can be all over the place on surveys. You try and pin them down, you try and fool them, you use tactics. I thought this was a very clever follow-up question that Pew asked. They asked about, did the people feel that there was religious extremism in the country? And only 28% felt that there was, 9% very, very much so, and 19% somewhat. So again, that's actually very concordant with the 83% who still want the Sharia. So I don't doubt the validity of this. Moreover, it's not happening in a vacuum. If you look at U.S. liberated Iraq with great blood and treasure, the numbers for those wanting the Sharia as the state government are 91%. If you go in the other direction and U.S. liberated Afghanistan, it's 99%. So these are not outlying data. If you look at the 5 largest Sunni Muslim populations in the world in the Pew Poll poll, so they reviewed about 6 or 7 years of polling in 2013, 77% of the 5 largest Sunni Muslim populations in the world, so that would be Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, and now the Muslim majority of Nigeria. If you look at those 5 populations pooled together, 77% want the Sharia to be the law of the land. Furthermore, when the sanctions were in place, despite that figure I showed you earlier where the enrichment was going on regardless, but when the sanctions were in place, 63% of Iranians still favored the nuclear program. So it doesn't give you much confidence that restoring the sanctions would do much to change attitudes. I'm going to skip over this, Brooke, but I did want to just at least give you the gist of some of these other slides. The Sharia is still being applied to non-Muslims. Jews were curiously left out of this report altogether. Now, they are a tiny minority. There's probably, the last figures were 8,800 in 2012. It might be even less than that. That's down from 120,000 after World War II. Even during the Pahlavi period, within 2 years of the creation of Israel, about 40,000 Jews left. So by the time Khomeini takes power, there's still 80,000 Jews. That drops precipitously down to somewhere around 25,000. Now there's less than 9,000 left. The problem I felt is that even conservative analysts of this very negative human rights report just weren't alluding to the Sharia. This is a Sharia state. This is what Sharia states do. I mean, we just have to not be afraid to say that. And I point out in the book at great length how the ideology for the reapplication of the Sharia comes from Tabande, who actually wrote in 1966 a critique of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and became Khomeini's favorite ideologue in terms of non-Muslim minority treatment. Again, I found it really quite awful that the UN Special Rapporteur couldn't bring himself to report on the condition of the Jews at all. It was really unpleasant. In the book, I summarize incredible work by Pouya Dayanim, who's an Iranian Jew, on literal reapplication of the dhimmi condition that I described for the Qajar and Safavid period. That's how the Jews live now, literally. Maybe minus some badging and things like that. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. The State Department confirms that itself. In 2012, there was a brutal murder of a Jewish woman who was originally known as Tuba N, and then we learned that her name was Tuba Nadaran. She was eviscerated, limbs amputated, simply because this is a poor Jewish woman. She refused to allow her house to be property and to be purchased so that a mosque could be expanded next to her property. Her husband was away on a trip, and they came in and annihilated her. So, 2 last quick things. Matt's argument that in that book that I recommended is that the only way to stop Iran's progression towards nukes is a tactical strike. He didn't want Israel to have to do it. He felt that they would be limited technically. They would suffer retaliation, although it's interesting when he researches the retaliation. It sounds horrific by U.S. standards. It is horrific. 300 civilian casualties in a retaliation should there be an Israeli strike. That's like 10,000 at least in this country. So it's not. It's something to think about. But at this point, after I actually contacted Matt after the extension was announced on November 24th, and he was so skeptical about an Israeli attack, but he said that that's the only thing left at this point until there's a change of mentalities, administrations, or whatever. But he really thinks that the U.S. could wipe it out. What's so tragic is that he goes into great detail. This could be done overnight. Overnight. The strikes that could delay this program for a good 5 years, maybe forever, given how history tends to evolve when these things are done. overnight. But, you know, that's not happening. And might it happen? Might it happen? I think it might. You know, well, you know, my favorite philosopher, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future, but the public doesn't like what's going on. 85% don't believe the Iranians' assertions about their nuke program. 81% do not believe it can be trusted to keep agreements. 69% oppose any agreement leaving Iran with nuclear capabilities. I don't think it's unreasonable to infer from these data that an attack might be supported if we had a strong enough administration. I could be wrong, and the public could say, "Oh, well, we didn't mean to actually attack," but it does lend credibility to the idea that maybe that would be and it's I'm done. Okay.
Okay, so we'll get you.
Oh.
All right, so Andy, thank you for that incredible presentation, detailed presentation. I want to open up for questions. I want to start with a question, and if you don't mind repeating the question
Sure.
that you get from the audience for the camera. So I'm going to play devil's advocate because you know and I know very well that anybody who goes out in the public and speaks openly and honestly about Sharia law and Islamist Jew hatred gets called an Islamophobe.
Right.
And you said in the beginning of your presentation, you just don't understand why people aren't speaking openly about it. Now, my answer to that would be because there is a systematic campaign to deceive the public as to what Islamism is, so that we don't understand the theological motivations behind the threat of Islamist terrorism. And you see that from the U.S. government. ISIS is not Islamic, the Taliban is not a terrorist group, Charlie Hebdo was not carried out by Islamists, and so forth. And then you always get also a moderate Muslim that comes on television and says, this is not my Islam.
Right.
So what are the responses to that when you have someone that we respect very much, like Kanta Ahmed or Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who go on television, who try very hard to, spark a reform of Islam, so to speak, given that they don't have a following like Khomeini does or the Al-Azhar University does? Should we not support them in their reformation? How do we do so while at the same time speaking honestly about literal Islam?
Right. I think that you've got the key in the last point there. I think it's up to us, actually, to create the space. And my criticism wasn't leveled. You made the very important point that there is this Islamophobia industry, and you could spell it with F-A-U-X, to demonize those who want to try and address these issues honestly, whether they're non-Muslims or secular Muslims or apostate Muslims or whomever they are. Hey, you're absolutely right about that. I actually was talking about what I think is a more insidious problem, which I find, frankly, even amongst conservatives, where there's still the whole idea that Islamic anti-Semitism is a borrowed phenomenon from Christianity, from post-Christianity, and that's really why I put together the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism. And I'm still baffled. There was I just think it was an absolutely appalling long op-ed by Rabbi Sachs this past weekend, which was in a pure state of denial, that this is a sui generis phenomenon of the post-Ottoman Empire. I mean, he's talking about this just evolved after 1922. I mean, so I guess that was more the thrust of my personal criticism. But it does apply to what you said, Brooke, because if we could at least get to the stage of whereas non-Muslims, and we're perfectly entitled to this, whether it's the anti-Christian themes in Islam as Christians, whether it's the anti-Semitic themes in Islam as Jews, we are perfectly entitled to talk about it in ways that relate it to the Islamic sources, to Islamic historical behavior, and I think that's incumbent upon us. I think if we do a better job with that, and deal with that more honestly and more factually and more categorically, I hope we will create space for real Muslim reformers, whether they still consider themselves to be Muslims or whether they consider themselves to be free thinkers who by accident of birth were born into Islamic societies and are entitled to their own patrimony, how they interpret it. I mean, I'm talking about people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Ibn Warq and Wafa Sultan. Wafa considers herself a Syrian. Ibn Warq considers himself, well, he was pre-partition India, but, of the Indian subcontinent. Ayaan considers herself, to some degree, African. I mean, they're entitled to that heritage too, and they have a different vision for how they would have liked their societies to be and how they might be in the future. So I think we create the space for all these people, whether they consider themselves Muslims or not religiously, but come from these Islamic societies, by ourselves speaking about these issues honestly, and hope that they will join us. I don't know how else to frame it. Yes, Jude?
I'm thrilled that we're all together here with you. I was going to ask Brooke's question, and I hosted Brooke in Kanta Ahmed, my home, so it is a very, very delicate but important conversation, and people like Kanta and Zuhdi Jasser, whom I admire for your essay on Zuhdi's problem. It was incredibly important, and Kanta is so brave in that she gets on, she says these are very difficult issues to talk about, and they can get just so far, but they can't go further. And it's Jonathan Sacks's article, which I thought was fantastic until the very end. And at the very end, I mean, it was very good in terms of summation, but I know Sophie was at an event with Shmuley Botea, who has this amazing personality, this amazing passion, and this amazing ability to take on all these issues. But, and I've been trying to email with him, he cannot, he had a recent piece on to Muslims, take back your religion. Take back your religion. I emailed and said, what is it that you think they're taking back? I mean, and unless, and I have not met a rabbi yet.
Rabbi Hausman.
Yeah, right, you're two. Rabbi Spiro Hausman, who are in any way knowledgeable about Islam.
Well, Rabbi Hausman studied in
Those are
Cairo
two.
and is fluent in Arabic,
Yeah.
and reads the sources, and
But
agrees.
how do you make that a part of rabbinical
gosh.
knowledge?
I mean,
because
yeah.
it's a huge problem. Because in my neighborhood, I mean, they are inviting members of mosques to come and speak, and they are perpetrating such a false. I saw Daisy Khan on CNN the other night saying what was and was not in the Quran.
I honestly, Judy, the only thing I could say is that I think it starts with being honest about what the sources are. Again, there isn't in any civilization a universal application of such dogma. Never, none. But the rather consistent application of it has and had demonstrable consequences, and we have to be willing to talk about this. My main mentor was Batya Or, Giselle Littman, and she told me, she's written about this honestly. She basically lived in the Nasser period, sort of a modern variant of a dhimmi's existence in Egypt. And she didn't even understand it herself until after she got out, and David was involved with a Mossad operation to get Jewish children out of Morocco. And she was posing as the wife of an Anglican minister. And she could be back as a British citizen and free of all the constraints of the Sharia mores or the actual law. And she looked at the people, the North African Moroccan Jews, and she understood finally the mentality that this engenders in them, that this kind of chronic oppression, even if it isn't physical violence all the time, engenders in them. And so I think these are the phenomena that we have to be honest about, and I don't hear it coming from many quarters. I just don't, and I think it's up to, again, I think it's up to the individual populations. I think it's up to Hindus to speak about this. I think it's up to Christians to speak about this. We heard some more with the Christians, in particular, with the ravages of the Islamic State. But I don't see where else it begins. Yes, Sophie?
Fascinating insight, even more depressing than I ever imagined. But here's my point. Personally,
Well, if we've depressed you, we've done a lot.
I know, that's what I'm saying. Here's my problem. I think we need to change the narrative. You see, as Jews, we always think that if we educate the world about the anti-Semitism that reared its ugly head again, we think people are going to be disgusted and shocked. How can this happen so soon after the Holocaust? But we have to assume that people scratch the surface and are anti-Semitic. People don't care about this. Everything you just said is fascinating, and every Jew should be privy and knowledgeable about what you've just said. But it's not going to resonate with anyone. We have to change the story. Forget about the anti-Semitism of the Quran. It doesn't apply to anyone except us. We have to give the same story about change Jew to Christian to infidel.
Right.
People
Well,
will care. No one cares.
No, but that's why no, you're right. But I am tying it in to the general look. In Iran, the Zoroastrians have long argued, particularly that was the indigenous culture before the Muslim conquests, and it's effectively was wiped out and sort of transferred to Mumbai of all places, and that's I think where the largest remnants of the Zoroastrian community are. There's some tiny remnants still in Iran, but they argued that the application, for example, of Najis was at least as severe towards them, and they're right. I mean, they're right, and the idea that Iran wants to wage a global jihad is obviously not just against Jews, but there's really no getting away from the little Satan, big Satan. It really does mean a lot to annihilate the Jews, particularly since they're gathered in one place now, and then move on to global conquest. We can't ignore that. But you're right in a sense that you know the jihad depredations historically and in real time now affect all these populations. So I absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Wait, to Sophie's point, so in your book, there's a list of all the Quranic and Hadith sources of Jew hatred. Where is there a similar list of the Quranic sources to kill the infidel? Does that exist? Do you have that?
We need to publicize that.
Yeah. I mean, in the first book that I wrote on jihad, it's very general in terms of the jihad regulations for all the non-Muslims. But there are like, for example, Quran 9:5 really has nothing to do with Jews or Christians. It's very much targeted towards pagans, and that would be animists, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. But the system of the Sharia applies to all non-Muslims, and you're right, Sophie. We can never forget that. But theologically, there is a centrality to the Jews, and we can't escape that either. I remember the reason that I went on, after I wrote The Legacy of Jihad, I was going to do a more expanded treatment on the application of the Sharia in detail to all these non-Muslim populations. And I was researching the Hindus, and I came across this discussion. There was a very interesting period in the Mughal era, where Akbar, who was a pious Muslim jihadist ruler, wound up becoming more or less a Hindu Muslim syncretist, abolished the jizya, this Quranic poll tax, introduced unheard of reforms, and the Muslim clerics rose up and wrote these horrific polemics, anti-Hindu polemics, etc. But in this anti-Hindu polemic, which I could understand from their perspective, it was upsetting their entire world order, and it was being done by one of them. There's a line by Sir Hindi, who's a Sufi, again, where Sufis are New Age, etc. He says, whenever a Jew is killed, it is for the benefit of Islam. And that just stopped. I researched him. He never met a Jew. There was no contact with Jews. And so it got me shifted onto the anti-Semitism book, because I wanted to understand where this at least the theological animus, came from. So you're absolutely right. We can't dissociate and harp too much on the plight of
No,
Jews.
we can to ourselves, but publicly.
Right. We
This
have
is
to
not
connect
about the
these
Jews.
things.
It's not about the Jews anymore. It's just not.
We absolutely have to connect, and in fact that's why Batya Or's major work to this day remains the decline of Eastern Christianity under Islam. She saw that. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry, the guy in the back was waving.
Yeah, I'll have to pay my $10 here. But,
Oh no! Come on, you got to do that.
I didn't pay that either.
you went on and on about the fact that Jews and other infidels are not Quranically very popular. I kind of knew that when I came here, and I suspect most of the rest of the people here did. But the title of your book is Iran's Final Solution for Israel. And I didn't hear that. Now, for
You didn't
years
hear what?
and years. What?
I'm sorry. Well, I don't understand what you didn't hear.
Iran's
didn't
final solution for
hear-
Israel.
The answer to your book, Iran's Final Solution for
I was
Israel
giving the theological
today,
basis
not
for
in
it.
1427.
Their weapons, their nuclear weapons program. I just don't get the whole thing. I guess I'm not getting the whole thing. Their nuclear weapons program is for the destruction of Israel.
Yeah.
I didn't make that clear at the beginning?
The question is...
I'm sorry, I just don't get the question.
I didn't ask it yet.
Well, I don't get the premise.
You don't want to.
All right, let him ask. Let him ask.
Should Iran get a nuke, or if they already have a nuke, how does that change the equation in the Middle East? What is the threat to
Because the threat to Israel is that if you read Professor Lou Barris's analysis of a nuclear holocaust, one successful strike. If you read it from Matt Kroenig, whose book I promoted here as well, it's horrific. The society can't really survive that. That's the consequence of one. The other problem is that it emboldens all of Iran's surrogates to do all kinds of nefarious things, whether it's conventional rocket attacks under the umbrella of a nuclear threat, or it's what would be the biggest suicide operation in the history of Islam would be to somehow figure out a suicide operation that involved nukes. So I think it's pretty clear. Yeah. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the book.
Oh, you're very welcome. Everyone's welcome.
The last slide that you
Even
had
he's
up,
welcome.
Huh? Wait, what?
the last slide that you had up there showed American public opinion, and I guess how that translates into politics. Traditionally, in this country, there's been bipartisan support, ostensibly bipartisan support of Israel, and in light of this latest pissing match over the Bibi invite, and I'm not about to point fingers as to which party screwed up on this thing, but are we witnessing the demise of bipartisan support in Israel, for Israel in this country?
Well, I don't want to invoke yogi too much, but look, I thought it was incredible, the statement that Menendez made, the original statement. He had a flash of this searing honesty where he said that, I hear the administration, I guess I'm paraphrasing, that they're essentially repeating the talking points of the Iranian regime. I couldn't believe I heard that coming out of an important Democratic senator. And yet, within a few days, there was this talk of, well, let's give them a few more months and see what we have by March, and not to push things. And in the end, I just find it a lot of blather about sanctions.
The reason I ask is because there's already talk of maybe some members of one of the parties may not show up at the speech, and how embarrassing that might be with the camera panning the House of Representatives and showing empty seats. Is that going to be damaging to our cause?
Oh.
No, it's embarrassing to the people who didn't show up because they
No.
didn't know who was going to speak
Is it
to
going
the
to
American
not
public.
embarrassing to the people who didn't show up, but is it going to hurt the image of bipartisan support for
I
Israel.
don't know. I guess who was speculated as to not show up? Democrats or
Yeah, the
Republicans?
Democrats.
Yeah.
Of course, the
Democrats
Democrats.
was
When
speculated not to show up to
Americans
Netanyahu's
listen
speech.
to what Netanyahu says,
so then
it'll
I would
be
agree with
obvious that
Brooke.
They don't care.
And I would agree with Brooke.
About the threat that he's talking about,
Right.
and it's
Obviously, he's coming to speak about Iran.
No. I guess I didn't really understand. Okay, so
People.
if that's what the speculation was, then I would absolutely agree with Brooke. I think
Which-
it would. Well, she was saying that it would be terribly embarrassing to the Democrats if they behaved that way.
It would be, but that might be a death wish. Who knows?
But he's made a compromise in the New York Times already. So what's the difference? Of course, it doesn't matter what that is. The compromise is there. The practicality is that we have to convince Congress and the American people that this is not a good compromise. What does it matter if they come or don't come?
Well, I will say I was at a
I don't
conference.
think it matters.
I was at a conference, and it was actually in the Capitol building. It was kind of neat. That was held, albeit in the basement in a conference room. And at least Trent Franks showed up and gave a really, really frightening discussion. He held up a book, I think it was originally in Farsi, and then it went into French, and he got it translated. But it was a proud discussion of how the Iranians are working on a nuclear detonation. This is for America. This is not even for Israel necessarily. A nuclear detonation in the atmosphere that would be an electromotive pulse.
Yeah.
But this was like a proud announcement, and apparently the National Defense Institute, one of its translation services, had translated it. And Trent Franks is saying, he's holding it up. He says, "This isn't secret. This is just a publication where they're proudly announcing that this is the fruits of their research. That they want to be able to do this." And then you see these reports of very anodyne vessels in the Caspian Sea, launching rockets that go straight up, and you go, well, gee, maybe they really are doing these experiments. So that's why, and getting back to Sophie's point, I think this is not. And when you see an ICBM, that range is way beyond Israel. They appear to be serious about this stuff. Yes, Ben.
Just one quick comment and then a question. In response to your question as to why people in the West sort of don't see the hatred of the infidel in Islam, I put forward 3 reasons why, quickly. One is projection, the notion that people in the West view all religions as the same. So Islam, Judaism, Christianity are all fundamentally the same. Same doctrine, same views, same goals, tactics, etc. Related to that is profound ignorance. You're trying to work on the ignorance part of it, and I think doing Yemen's work in doing so. And the third thing is an uncomfortability with the actual implications that you put forth. That there could be millions of Muslims that actually want to kill the infidel, because what does that mean? What does that mean our policy should be? How should we deal with this? It's very uncomfortable for tolerant, pluralistic societies to deal with.
Right.
Now, a question for you, and this is this would be sort of like in the best case scenario. We see Iran expanding its tentacles in Yemen, obviously the Assad-backed regime, and elsewhere, Lebanon. And then you obviously have Sunni forces as well. Do you see there being a massive Sunni-Shia conflagration where, sort of like the Iran-Iraq war the first time, where they sort of kill each other and Israel isn't caught in the crosshairs, and that actually works to Israel and the West benefit?
It was looking maybe that way when it seemed to be more focused in Iraq. Now that it's so close to Israel, in Syria, and then you saw these events that took place on or near the Golan itself, you begin to say that, gee, maybe it wouldn't be sort of self-contained, and there'd be tremendous deterioration of both odious sides. That somehow there's enough spillover that we could see real problems, and I think we're getting sort of a frightening foretaste of that with Hezbollah now too. So but geostrategic analysis like that is not my bag, but it looks a little frightening to me. Again, like when it was focused in Iraq, and we were dealing with these horrific scenes of the attacks on the Yazidis and the Christians and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and supporting the Iraqi regime against ISIS. I think it's spread too far to say that would be the most likely outcome. I think it underscores one thing that again it just struck me, and I can't emphasize enough to read Matt's book, because again he's counsel on foreign relations. This guy has brass cojones to do what he's done. Counsel on foreign relations, Georgetown University associate professor. I pray to God he has tenure. And yet it's a pellucid analysis as to why these aren't good options. It's just about all that's left. Just do something. And what he points out that's actually quite remarkable is that I guess it's different if you look at Nazi Germany, and that was unbelievably massive ordnance and U.S., Brits, etc. They never got to produce nuclear weapons, and the regime dissolved. If you look at, actually, at least temporarily, Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war knocked out a primordial Iranian facility. Israel, of course, knocked out Iraq's facility in Osirak. Israel again in 2007, even under the generally feckless Omer, managed to gird his loins and take out the Iraq during Syria. Until we heard these recent reports that something's going on again in Syria, that gave us a temporary hiatus. So what Matt points out is that every time this has been done, it's delayed a nuclear program, in some cases indefinitely. And I think that is the historical record. And also when I learned, not being a tactical military person, that between B-52 launched cruise missiles and this massive ordnance penetrator from B-2s, this entire campaign to destroy Iraq, which is the plutonium facility, and I believe that's above ground, the uranium ore processing facility in Isfahan, which is also above ground, and then even the two hardened sites. The one at Qom Fordow is very deep. It's about 300 feet deep with reinforced concrete. The one in Natanz is another uranium enrichment facility. That's about 70 feet. That could all be done in an evening of bombing and combined bombing and missile strikes. And Kronig estimates that would be at least a 5-year delay. And again, given the historical record, potentially indefinitely. Now, what he says about Israel is that Israel can get rid of the surface sites. So Iraq and the ore processing facility in Isfahan, it could do significant damage to the Natanz facility, which is about 70 feet deep. It can't do anything about Qom Fordow, given known current capabilities. But those strikes, he says, could delay the program at least a couple of years. Again, this is beyond my area of expertise, but that sounds reasonable given the alternative, which is that we'll have this feckless pursuit of policy. You'll see that graph of the uranium enrichment. God knows what else is going on that we have no idea about, and that's why Matt reluctantly was willing to give me that quote for a piece I wrote back in the fall after the extension was announced. Yes.
This is all horrific, and as you know, I know a great deal of it. But what really alarmed me is last week learning that the State Department has released already $400 million of frozen assets to Iran and plans to give them $11 billion. So basically,
we're bankrolling this too.
We are bankrolling this operation, which is what they're going to call it. What can we do? I know this is not but what can we do?
Ask Brooke. No, seriously, it's a political thing. I don't pretend to have any knowledge how to deal with politicians. I'm not the most politically correct person to be dealing with that, or giving advice to do that. But yeah, it's a huge problem. Yes.
Do you think that El-Sisi, who seems incredibly brave to go to Al-Aqsa, has a shot at actually changing Islam by saying, let's clean up the Quran and get rid of the abrogated verses so that it's easier to
if he said that,
yeah,
it's a far cry from that. I know this is I know this is against the popular meme, but I actually analyzed Cece's War College thesis. You know, I had to get it, believe it or not, by a FOIA request. I mean, this is something that we pay for when these, you know, Muslim military folks come and train in our military academies. But anyway, they produced these mini theses. I don't know, you'd call it a term paper by our standards. But one of his colleagues put his online immediately. He was still a general, General Soki. And it had, you know, boilerplate anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, et cetera, et cetera. I was shocked when I couldn't just find Cece's, and the library wouldn't release it to me. I eventually teamed up with what is it, the legal, they do a lot of
Judicial
FOIA
Watch?
requests. Judicial Watch, I'm sorry, Judicial Watch. Judicial Watch, and we got it quickly. It's American taxpayer property. We got it, and it was a very interesting, ambivalent, alarming document to read where he was singing the praises of the caliphate system. Now you could say, well, but you could say, look, this is a romantic, you know, Muslim view of a system that we might not find so romantic, and so I was willing to give a little bit of a pass on that, although it was a cause for concern. What was consistent and what was, to me, more alarming is that he was, and remains so, I think, and I'll demonstrate that, virulently anti-secular. He is opposed to the kind of secular. He is opposed to the kind of Western secular consensus that the Brits tried to bequeath to Egypt to try and make it so that they could create a truly pluralistic society. They have rejected it ever since the 1923 Constitution, at least, and Sisi ain't going there. He's orchestrated on his watch, not as sort of a residual from Morsi. You could make that argument. Oh, well, Morsi set things in place. No, he's orchestrated a new campaign to, quote, extirpate atheism in Egypt. Now, why, you ask? Well, he was told by Al-Azhar that there's a terrible plague of atheism in Egypt. Why? I had my kids do the math on this. It was a good math problem for them when we were I was driving them home from school. I said, kids, we'll round off the numbers. There's actually 866 atheists, according to Al-Azhar, in Egypt. Egypt's population is 82.5 million. I want you to round off the 866 to 800, and you tell me what percentage that is. And they go, oh, that's easy, Pop. That's 0.001%. You know, and so, I mean, 0.001% is a national tragedy. He's also done nothing to stem the tide of prosecutions, not just persecutions, for blasphemy, which obviously targets the Copts. In Egypt. On the other hand, I mean, you know, geostrategically, he's in a battle with arch jihadists, very violent ones that could not only threaten him but threaten Israel. So that's certainly a good thing. But that, to me, is a separate question from him as being a transformative figure that's going to change Islam. You know, it was very revealing. Memory had. It's piecemeal. I don't know if anyone can find it, please send it to me. I cannot find the entire speech that he gave on New Year's Day. I just see different clips of it. And Memory had a very interesting piece which was sort of complementary to these other pieces that are out there, where he literally turns to Grand Imam Al-Tayyib and mentions something, you know, good Grand Imam, I forget exactly how he puts it, but it's suggestive that he wants him to do something, but for heaven's sake, this is a guy, Grand Imam Al-Tayyib, who succeeded Tantawi, who I quoted earlier with that magnum opus, and it's just ugly, ugly Jew hatred. Grand Imam Tantawi has done very concrete things recently that he could have called him out on. For example, in the fall, he said that the conflagrations going on in the Middle East and the horrors inflicted by ISIS are all the fault of a global Zionist conspiracy. Now, he could have said, Grand Imam, please, you know, these kinds of things, we can't say these things anymore. We have problems, but it's not global Zionism. Let's start dealing, you know, with our own issues, etc. Some example. More concretely, and of course he never would have done this, is that Al-Tayyib, a year before he claims that Zionism, Jewry, is responsible for ISIS, et cetera, and the conspiracies to divide the Muslim world. That's how he put it. That was October of this year, so September, October of 2013, he gives an interview, and he quotes Quran 582, which says that the Jews harbor the greatest hatred for the Muslims. It's sort of classic psychological projection, and of course it's used in turn to justify hatred of the Jews. Al-Tayyib gives an interview, just calmly, matter-of-factly, no high-pitched voice or anything, says, yes, well, this is the legacy that the Quran teaches us. This is the problem that we've been dealing with for 1,400 years. It's the same then, the same now. It's the same problem. The Quran defines it for us. This is what we have to be aware of. So there are concrete things that he could have said. And so, again, it's open, it's ambivalent, it's open to interpretation. Geopolitically, I don't have any problem with what he's doing. I don't think that we turned a blind eye to him waging a campaign against what we, as Westerners at least, appropriately respect as our most fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. That's not a minor blemish on someone's record and actions. So I don't think he gets any pass on that. On the other hand, if he's going to go back to sort of a more Mubarak way of dealing, with international relations and stability issues, obviously there's nothing wrong with that.
Andy, let's take one more question.
Sure.
But if you could also address using the term jihad. There's a debate on that because what it means is holy war. And even though when we say jihad, we know what we mean as a violent conquest against the infidel. But the literal translation is holy war. So do we want to keep repeating holy war, or do we have another name for it?
Actually, my dear host, I do have to say if you look at the root of the word and all its usages in the Quran, it does mean struggle. So it can mean nonviolent struggle. The way it is used, and there are different sort of philological analyses of this, but two that are very good, that look carefully, indicated that there are somewhere between 35 and 40 usages of the root of the word in the Quran. And with the exception of one in particular, and maybe two or three others where it's more elusive, it all means violent struggle. And then, of course, you have the jurists over the years that formulated it into this doctrine of warfare. So certainly we shouldn't be silenced into submission. Oh, then of course the other chestnut that they'll bring out is that Muhammad talked about the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And of course the lesser jihad, quote unquote, is violent warfare, and the greater jihad is this spiritual turning inward, of course, just to become a better Muslim, really, is what it means. It turns out that, and this is why the fundamentalists are so important to read, is that they don't like that stuff. First of all, it's a Sufi notion, and they have researched it, and then independent Western scholars have followed up on their inside Muslim baseball research. And there's no canonical hadith where Muhammad ever says that. It's sort of a Sufi tradition that doesn't exist in the 6 canonical collections of hadith. However, and I first learned this from Sayyid Qutb, of all people, and then I confirmed it on my own, because I don't want to trust Sayyid Qutb because he's an evil fundamentalist. But it turns out there's a canonical hadith in Sahih Muslim, which is the 2nd most important collection of hadith, where the priority is exactly the opposite. Jihad warfare is first, preaching about jihad is second, and yes, this idea of just doing things sort of in a passive, non-violent way or an inward way is the least, it says in the hadith, the least respected form of jihad.
Wait, which
so
hadith was it?
It's in Sahih Muslim. I can send me an email. I'll track it down for you.
Okay.
I have it.
All right.
But so yes, we absolutely should not give any quarter on this idea that certainly as brought forward by the jurists, including modern jurists, that jihad, for practical purposes, certainly for non-Muslims, is warfare against the infidel.
Okay.
One more.
All right. Now, I got a copy of your book from Frank Gaffney's event, and I've been reading through it. And right off the bat, you have this story about this this imaginary fatwa that prohibits nuclear weapons. Now, where in the world did they come up with this?
It's almost classic John Kerry. Just basically what he's talking about is that right after the original P5+1 was announced in November of 2013, November 24th of 2013, and even in the weeks leading up to it, Kerry would go, Ayatollah Khomeini has written a fatwa that prohibits nuclear weapons development. I've seen the fatwa. I know he'd go blather on and on about it. First of all, there is no written fatwa. Now, one thing you can accuse the Iranian clerics of, that you can't accuse them of, is not being prolific in writing fatwas. So if he wanted to write a fatwa that prescribed the use of nuclear weapons, he could write a fatwa to that effect. It turns out, and again, the fact checker from the Washington Post, Glenn Kessler, looked into this, and he felt that it was basically a fatuous claim, because it turns out that over the years, Khamenei has burbled some statements, but essentially there's no written fatwa whatsoever. And in fact, even his statements have evolved towards stockpiling weapons, potentially, but he hasn't come out and saying actually using them. And then, of course, when you combine even his public statements, which are pro-stockpiling, with his statement endlessly about the annihilation of Israel, with the cancer metaphors and things like that, you have to say this is pretty thin gruel altogether. But again, even the Washington Post fact checker Glenn Kessler felt that basically that was a pretty fatuous claim.
Thank you, Andy.
Oh, thank you.
Well, that's it. Wow, that's what happens.
Great.